Well, good morning, A-pushers. Purpose of this video is going to take a look at topic 8.14 about a society in transition. 814 is really about the 1970s and the transition from the kind of the heady days of 60s liberalism and the rights movements that are going to change and kind of start getting us set up to where we are more and more for like modern politics. This is the first of two videos here on 814. This one is going to kind of get a little bit of an overview between 60s conservatism, excuse me, and then a little bit about how in the 1970s there's just a pattern of declining confidence and trust in the United States government. So here we go. So when we start talking about the conservative movement that is really going to take shape in the 1970s and 80s, we need to look at this in the context of the 1960s. In order to really kind of see what's going on with conservatives in the 1960s, it's worth a little quick reminder on 1960s liberalism and a little bit of this overview on the Great Society, because the Great Society programs were really designed to be a continuation of concepts developed during the New Deal. The idea that you can use the federal government power and authority to try to support more Americans in more ways, even if whether you're talking about Americans in poverty, or if you're talking about civil rights, or you're talking about just like American rights in general, there is an effort being made to use the power of the government to achieve social goals, kind of like it says in there. Well, in the 1960s, I mean, that's not everybody that's believing this. So, on the flip side of this, so far as the political thoughts are concerned, conservatives in the 60s are going to they're going to challenging liberal laws and liberal court decisions that are coming in. And in some of these cases, it's not really like we're talking about things in terms of like liberalism and the civil rights movement, although I think there is a little bit of that from pro-segregationist elements that are still in the American South. But other elements of talking about rights, and maybe we're just going too far in protecting people's rights. Case in point here. Considered a liberal court decision by most Americans in the 1960s. Is the case of Miranda v. Arizona. This is a case that is instrumental in determining what we now refer to as the rights of the accused, or criminal rights in the United States. If you have ever seen any kind of a cop show or movie whatsoever, when somebody is arrested, they tell them that you have the right to remain silent, and anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and that you have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Uh, the need to inform people of their rights as soon as they're arrested, that is a decision that is made by the Supreme Court in this case. Not going too far into the details here, I mean, Miranda was accused of committing a crime, but as this kind of goes through the court proceedings and the appeals process after his conviction, it is determined that he was not aware of what his rights were, and that he may have been forced or coerced or tricked into a confession of sorts. So the need to kind of protect the rights of the accused is a real right, because you're talking about an era where there were concerns about abuse of power coming from law enforcement. But for conservatives in the 1960s, there are immediately questions about the rights of the victim. That if we're going to have, efforts made to protect the rights of alleged criminals, then we are kind of setting things up for maybe even greater immorality and instability in the country than what was already going on. And from a conservative perspective in the 1960s, there's a lot of immorality and instability in the 1960s, because they really are perceiving a moral and a cultural decline. And this is they're seeing this because of anti-war protests, the growth of the counterculture movement. This is really kind of a desire to have a callback to calmer, more stable times, kind of like the 1950s, which were also very conforming times. But this is, I mean, not everybody's going to go towards that, non-conformity movement that the 60s kind of are emblematic of. So the conservative movement in the 1960s is kind of like a small scale movement as far as like politics are concerned. It's not anything. Look, Barry Goldwater is a conservative candidate for president in 1964, and as a counterpoint to running against Lyndon Johnson, getting ready for the Great Society, Barry Goldwater is running on a couple of really strong campaign promises. And I don't have Goldwater's name in here, but he's a relatively strong name to keep track of in defining what modern conservatism is going to be in the United States. Um, and two of the real big goals on this are going to be to limit the role of the federal government. That maybe the federal government is doing too much, and by doing too much, you're running the risk of a government, gaining more and more power and ultimately abusing that power. There are concerns about that from conservative groups in the 1960s going through today in modern politics. There is also a desire to be more assertive in foreign policies. Barry Goldwater in 1964, running as a Republican candidate, he was very much pro um, greater aggression in getting control of the Vietnam War. Maybe it's not a question of just sending in more troops. Maybe it's a question of sending in more technology to get greater control for what is going to be in the best interest of the country altogether. This kind of political tension in the 1960s is going to stay kind of in the background. There's still political debates, but the liberal movements in the 1960s are going to be the dominant movements. That's why we spent a lot of time talking about the anti-war protests and the civil rights movement and other rights movements in the 1960s. But by the time we get into the 1970s, the liberal movements of the 60s are really kind of getting to the point where it does seem out of control, where there is a little bit more instability and insecurity. And so in the 70s, the clashes get to be more, well, better defined and more in the public eye and more in regards to what direction the country is going to go in the long term. And these clashes are really kind of boiling down to there's a general decline in public confidence and in trust in the government. Some of this is because of the Vietnam War and the cover-up and scandals that go along with this. Some of this is with the Watergate scandal. Some of this is with just like economic problems and issues that are developing in the 1970s. But this is specifically what these next couple of slides are going to get into. So let's get into them. So when we get into the decline of public confidence and public trust in the government in the 1970s, it's really about political scandals. And when we talk political scandals in the 1970s, the poster child of this, so to speak, is going to be the Watergate scandal. In years past, I have gone into a great amount of detail in Watergate, and I have gone into just the bare minimum of details on Watergate so far as like what you really need to know. I'm trying to hit a little bit of this middle ground on this, so I'm getting enough information to you so it makes sense, but not getting too bogged down in details. Okay, so step one, the buildings complex that's here, that is the Watergate complex. It includes a hotel, which is there, that circular end of it on the right side, and then the rest of it are just office buildings where there's a lot of activity going on in there. In 1972, one among the offices that are in there are the headquarters for the Democratic National Committee. That's the Democratic Party headquarters. In the summer of 1972, there's a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters, and 5 people are arrested. And it turns out that these people were breaking into filing cabinets and trying to either take pictures of campaign strategy documents. And they have got, surveillance equipment that they are captured with. And, they were trying to put like microphones and listening devices in there. And as they are arraigned, it kind of turns out that at least a couple of these guys are employed by the campaign to re-elect Richard Nixon for president. And so automatically it looks like there are questions to be had here. They are convicted of the break-in, and then by the time you get into 1973, it begins to there's newspaper reports that start to come out that are showing that there was a cover-up that was involved in this. That in fact that the White House was, if not aware of the break-in before it happened, they were aware of the break-in quickly after it happened, and in an effort to try to keep this from getting too far into the press and and trying to have too many implications and accusations of President Nixon, there was hush money that was paid, and that there was a level of secrecy that was kind of mandated for this, and there gets to be a lot of accusations back and forth. And then by the beginning of 1974, it kind of turns out, revelations with some congressional hearings, that there are recordings that were secretly made in the White House that kind of showed that there was possibly like a presidential knowledge on this cover up, that he was condoning a crime and obstructing justice for that crime. Ultimately, by 1974, the accusations against Nixon and the requests for these Watergate tapes, as evidence in this, Nixon declares that he has executive privilege, but the Supreme Court weighs in 1974 and says that there is no executive privilege in this case because it's not a matter of national security, that there is a crime that has been committed and is a crime that is relevant for pursuit. So when Nixon loses this court case in 1974, it begins to look seriously like there is a process towards his impeachment and his removal from office. And before the scandal of impeachment comes in, and remember, this is going on like in the months after the Paris Peace Accords that ended American involvement in Vietnam, but there's the energy crisis and the oil embargo, and there's all these other issues that are taking place. And before it gets to the point of impeachment, Nixon chooses to resign. And the picture here of his resignation letter is one of these like really short, easy to kind of come across, points. He's the only president to ever resign. This is kind of represents an end of a decade-long stretch where you have presidencies that kind of unexpectedly end. Nixon resigns. LBJ was starting his reelection campaign when he decides not to run because of issues in the Vietnam War, and then President Kennedy was assassinated. So through the 1960s and early 70s, there's just instability in the office of the president, and the kind of scandal that goes on with this, whether it's Watergate or the Pentagon Papers, or Vice President Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, resigned in 1973 because he was being accused and was ultimately convicted of accepting bribes when he was the governor of Maryland. So political scandals are kind of increasing this lack of trust in government. When you add in that the Vietnam crises that are going on, like whether it is the fall of Saigon or the Pentagon Papers, or when you get into the oil embargo that we've kind of seen over on topic 8.13, all the way through the 1970s, there are just kind of ongoing issues that people don't trust the government. I think we still feel that a lot today. I kind of put the Iran hostage crisis in here, maybe a little bit more of an issue when we get into definitely in the late 70s and going to the early 80s even. The Iran hostage crisis and the attempts to free 52 American hostages in Iran is going to end in abject failure for the Carter administration at the end of the decade. And there's just this sense that the United States government can't get things done like they need to get done. And since this is really associated for a lot of Americans with the liberalism of the 1960s, this helps create a desire for political change towards 1970s and what's going to become 1980s conservatism. And then the other end of what's going on in the 1970s that's really kind of causing a lot of people personal strife is going to be the economic stagflation that's taking place. Stagflation is kind of a made-up word. It is a combination of two words. Inflation, which is like the increasing prices that we have experienced here in 2022, 2023, but also the element of a stagnant economy. Usually in economic cycles, when you see inflation, it's because the economy is moving too fast. But what you get in the 1970s, really for the first time ever, is a situation where the economy is slowing down, which would normally create lower prices. But because of other issues in the 1960s and 70s, prices kind of maintain themselves. And so this is really pretty extreme on some of this. So reasons for this. Reason one is that there's a greater level of international competition. I tend to refer to the auto industry as the great example on this because the American auto industry was dominant in the American marketplace in the 1950s and 60s, with Chrysler, Ford, and GM being the big three automakers. But by the 1970s, Honda and Toyota and Nissan and Volkswagen, as well as like BMW and Mercedes and Audi. You have some foreign car companies that are starting to kind of get further into the American market, and they are making some very fuel efficient vehicles, and that's kind of a big deal as well. But as they start kind of chipping away at the American auto industry, this is going to, well, hurt a large sector of the economy. There's a need for these fuel efficient cars thanks to the oil crisis. Gas prices are high, so you need a more fuel efficient car, and Japanese and German cars are just better at this than American car makers are in the 1970s. So the slowdown in the auto industry is going to lead towards a little bit more of a development to deindustrialization. The United States is starting to shift from a industrial manufacturing economy to more of a service-based economy, and that's where we are in the United States economy these days. Lots of emphasis in modern and 21st century United States on service industries, whether that means like hotel and restaurant management or vacation management and that kind of thing. There's just more imported goods, manufactured goods coming to the country from places like, well, China or Taiwan or other parts of Asia, and to a lesser extent in Africa and South America. What this does is that it kind of speeds up this development of the Sun Belt. And this map is really, kind of trying to show like major urban centers. And I'm kind of pointing this out here because in the South, these different ones, including like where we are now, this is the point where like Houston and the Gulf Coast and the Texas Triangle sees like a huge amount of population growth towards the Sun Belt. People are moving here from what used to be called the Steel Belt. Here in the Great Lakes region, like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Cincinnati, a lot of these big industrial centers, and Detroit. These big industrial centers are starting to see decline, and so they are referred to as the Rust Belt. And as you get from the 70s into the 80s, 90s, and 21st century, there's not just population decline there is an economic decline that is there. And since unionization was strong in these areas, there is a general decline in organized labor around the country. I feel like in modern 21st century, we're starting to see some newsworthy events about the potential growth of organized labor in the service industry, with groups like Amazon and Starbucks starting to deal with some unionization issues and organized labor issues in their companies. But here in the 70s, this is going to lead to a decline in the economy because, well, weaker labor groups means like weaker salary structures for a lot of people. Things begin to be more industrialized. Jobs begin to move overseas, and there's the slowdown in the economy that happens. The slowdown of the economy is also going to be amplified because of women in the workforce and young people in the workforce as well. These groups are going to, while it is a benefit they are entering the workforce, it is going to lead to some depressed salaries because tradition meant that they were being paid less. And so there's just like an economic slowdown so far as the flow of money is concerned. But costs are high. Costs are high because the expense of the Great Society programs and the expense of the Vietnam War means there are higher taxes coming from the federal government, and because of oil embargoes and energy crises in the 1970s, there are also rising energy costs. And all of this combination of issues really kind of gets to a spot where it is really a great unknown as to what to do to fix them. So this is the worst economic period in American history since the Great Depression. Like between the 1930s and the 1970s, the economy had been going pretty strong on an unprecedented level. And even here in the 2020s, when we talk about like the spikes in inflation, they talk about it's the highest inflation rate since in 40 years. That means the inflation rates that we have now, as rough as they are for people, they're not as rough as they were back in the 1970s, where inflation kind of peaks at 13%. which means while your wages may be declining one year to the next, the average cost of goods is jumping by 13% every single year. And this just has an ongoing burden on more and more people. And since there's an unawareness about how the government can do anything to fix this, you get another example of a declining trust in the government and a declining confidence in what it actually means to be an American and what the American point status is in the rest of the world. In the second part of 814, we'll take a look at some of the other social issues and political issues that are coming up and get out of the realm of politics and economics, but we'll do that on the next video. Thanks for listening.